people in. Good evening, good Erev Shabbos. It's Thursday evening, Leil Shishi, and we are approaching the Torah portion of Noach. So one time a little girl was sitting on her grandfather's lap and was feeling his gnarly face with her hand, scraggly beard. And she says, "Grandfather, is it true that you were born many, many years ago?" He says, "Yes." And she says, "Is it true that I was born only a few years ago?" He says, "That's right." She feels her face, how smooth and soft it is, and she says, "I think the world is getting more and more beautiful as time goes on." In Parshas Noach, this week's Torah portion, we're talking about one of the most greatest events of upheaval in the history of mankind, even as we don't really understand what the problem was. Obviously, we're talking about the case of the Tower of Babylon, Migdal Bavel. I'm not exactly sure what went wrong there. We look at the story, we see what happened. The descendants of Noach, he had three sons, Shem, Chom, and Yafes. And they come out of the ark and they rebuild a society. The three of them, they have a civilization that comprises many nations, many different people. And eventually they would become the 70 nations of the world. And eventually those would morph into all the nations that we have today. They were very successful. In just 400 years since the flood, the world was rebuilt. There were plenty of nations, plenty of cultures. Now, the leaders of that generation, they saw that if this goes on much longer, there's going to start being competition. There's going to start being disillusionment, envy. There's going to be a struggle for power. Who's going to be in charge of who's going to have geographical power and who's going to have the rights to the natural resources. And pretty soon there's going to be war and bloodshed and upheaval if we don't do something about it. So they make a world congress. For the first time in the history, there's a world congress. What do they come up with? They come up with the following revolutionary idea. Let's make one place. All the nations of the world will live in this one valley. We'll make a big city. We'll make at the gate of the city this huge tower that will represent our success, our achievements, our security, and will be a symbol of this revolutionary, single-minded civilization that we're trying to build. It's a beautiful idea. And this way, there'll be no fighting. If ever there's a disagreement, we'll come together, we'll discuss it, we'll have, the elders of the community will help put it together, or we'll have the judge, or we'll vote by majority if it's a democracy. We'll work it out. There'll be no more fighting. There'll be no more need, no more concern that we'll start battling with each other. It's recorded that their primary fear is that if they'll start fighting with each other, then Hashem will punish the world again with another flood. So this was their plan. They're going to have a single language. And not only they're going to have a single language, they will have one ideal, one philosophy that they'll all live by. And that's it. And there'll be peace in the world. As the progress on their project goes forward, we find out about Hashem's answer. What does Hashem say? They're all going to be one together with each other. Ooh, that's not good. That's very bad. If they're united, they could accomplish anything. Even their wildest dreams they'll accomplish if they're all united together as one. That's terrible. So what does Hashem do? He says, I'm going to spoil the relationship that they have with each other. They're not going to understand each other. They're going to argue. There's going to be falling out. And this way, the whole plan will fall to pieces. Baruch Hashem, there's infighting, and the nations of the world will spread out across the world, and they will, in fact, have all this envy and the fight for power and everything that they were worried about originally. We study this story, and we don't understand what went wrong. Isn't this even an ideal to live up to? Peace among all the nations of the world. Could there be anything better? What's Hashem so upset about? The Medrash that's supposed to have all the backstory, even it says, listen, The cause for the flood, we know. The cause for the dispersion in the generation of that tower, we don't know. We don't know. But of course, that didn't stop the commentators from turning over every single word and every single letter, trying to find the reason. What's the reason for the dispersion? Why was Hashem displeased with this plan? It was such a good plan. So in a meeting in the 80s and 90s, the Rebbe had meetings with supporters of the Lubavitcher Yeshiva. Every year, once a year, there would be a dinner, and after the dinner, or in conjunction with the dinner, they would go to the shul of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and they would have a meeting, and the Rebbe would talk to them and share with them words of Torah. And these talks were always very universal and very, very personal. You could really take home a message that applied to everybody and every community. And so one time, the Rebbe discussed this story about the Tower of Bavel, the Tower of Babylon. And the Rebbe said, under this quest for unity and peace, there was something else going on. This generation was committed to create for themselves a world where you didn't need to rely on God, where you didn't need to search for anything intangible, where you didn't need to fill your heart and your soul and your yearning for meaning with something spiritual. Everything about their lives was going to be tangible, practical, scientific. And the Torah even tells us about this, alludes to this in the language that it describes, in the language that describes the people's plan. We're going to build a great city. We're going to build a tower whose top reaches the heavens, they said. Not only will it reach the heavens, they were saying our tower, our achievements will replace heaven. We won't need it anymore. We will live our lives in contentment because of the things that we achieve. We will come up with our own moral code. We will come up with our own philosophy. We will just live and let live. That's going to be our moral code. I don't bother you. You don't bother me. I don't encroach on your property. You don't encroach on my property. If we ever have a debate, well. And now we understand what the problem is. A civilization that's built on human morality, that means a moral code that's invented by human beings, has no future. It has no possibility of surviving, of succeeding. Why? Because eventually, sooner or later, somebody is going to put their personal interest in front of the public, in front of the collective interest. And it's happened over and over and over. Even Germany, which was the height of civilization of its era, the height of science, the height of philosophy. All it took is for a little twist, and a very advanced, highly civilized country put its own interests in front of somebody else's. And the result, you know. Einstein says, what is it? Insanity, I don't know if he used the words insanity. Insanity is trying the same thing over and over and expecting different results. Well, here we are again. We're living in a time when there is an effort, or there has been an effort, to push humanism. Human beings don't need a superior moral guide. We can figure it out ourselves. We can do it. Hashem does not agree. Hashem didn't agree then, and he does not agree now. And therefore, in those days, in the Tower of Bavel, he ruined the relationship between the people, and he caused them to disperse, and he reminded them that without a moral code coming from someplace higher, from God, a civilization cannot survive. A civilization will not work. On the other hand, if you have a morality, if you have an ethical code that's based on something higher, based on something finer, based on God's will, here's an example. You'll never lose sight of the eternal value of every single human being. Jew and non-Jew, it doesn't matter. Your group or somebody else's group, it doesn't matter, because God's moral code puts every human being at the top of the line. Recently, a very beautiful story that's a great example of this came out. The former chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau, had an interview, and he shared some of his life story. It was in October 1942. The Nazis stormed into the city where he lived as a child with his family. His father was the rabbi of the city. And they started with the Aktia. They started putting together all the men in one place where they would ship them off to Buchenwald. They were going to ship them off to Treblinka. And the women and children they left at home, they would deal with them later. While the young boy is waiting at home with his mother, the father all of a sudden comes rushing into the house. He had escaped from the city, from the town square, and he tells his wife and his child, he says, I found you an attic on the 4th floor, on top of the 4th floor in one of the empty buildings where you can go hide. And then his father says, I have to get back to the town square before they realize that the rabbi of the city is missing. They're going to turn the city upside down. It'll be bad for everybody. I have to go, and so do you. Go to that house, the 4th floor, hide in the attic. That's where you'll be safe. The young boy and his mother, they ran over to that house. They climbed up into the attic, and they found 10 other people there. And they crawled in together, and the whole group stayed there hiding in absolute terror. They were there for a while, and all of a sudden they hear the sound of boots. The Nazis found this house, and they were going throughout the city, floor to floor, level to level, checking for people who were hiding. And they come higher and higher, closer and closer, until they get to the 4th floor. And remember, this family is hiding in the attic above the 4th floor, and the Nazis, they come to the 4th floor, and they're looking around, they're tearing down walls. They decided that there's somebody hiding under the floorboards, and they start tearing up the floorboards. You can imagine the terror, the absolute horror and terror. The people in the attic are scared to death. Absolutely still, not moving. The Nazis were there for 2 hours, tearing up the house underneath them. They never found them. "50 years later, Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau, he's now the chief rabbi of Israel. At that point, he was the chief rabbi of Israel. He's sitting in his office. He's meeting with people. And his secretary says, there's a visitor here from London. He wants to see the rabbi for just 5 minutes. In walks a very respected, regal-looking chassid, a gerer chassid, and he has in his hand a book that's wrapped in a newspaper. He puts it down on the rabbi's table, and he says, my name is Motel. He told him his last name also. And he says, this is the book that I wrote about my life, my experience, I survived the war and my whole life story. But I decided that before I publish my book, I have to take care of one last thing that I left unfinished in my life. And that is that I have to ask you for your forgiveness. Forgiveness? For what? He says, when we were hiding in that attic, you were there with your mother, and your mother had given you a bag, and in that bag there was some food and there was apples. I was there. By that point, I had already lost my father. I had already lost my mother. I was there alone. I was starving. And when nobody was looking, I took an apple out of your bag, and I took a big bite out of that apple. And as soon as I took a bite out of the apple, we heard the sound of the boots of the Gestapo coming. And so I was afraid to chew. I couldn't swallow. The piece was too big, but I was afraid to chew because I was worried the soldiers would hear the sound of the chewing. I also didn't want to spit the apple out because then people around me might realize that I stole it. So I sat there absolutely frozen with this huge piece of apple in my mouth for 2 hours. And now I have to, before I close up the book on my life story, I have to get forgiveness from you for taking that apple. And in the interview, Rabbi Lau starts crying. He says the family invited him to give the eulogy at this man's funeral. And he says he stood there in front of the open van and he's looking at Motel. You can't see Motel anymore. You could just see the talus. He's wrapped in a white shard, in a white, what's it called? And he says to him, Motel, you have no idea. Believe me, I forgave you right away, even back then. And it didn't matter if it was you or anybody else. I understood you then, and I forgave you already then. That's only possible when you absolutely have no doubt about the value of every human life, not just your own. When personal interests don't rise higher in your priority list than other people's well-being. And that's the message, really. To try to build a civilization without reliance on God's moral code, without the reliance on something higher, something holier, it simply doesn't work. That's not in us. We are not so clear-headed. We're not so clear-minded. We're passionate. Not only that, humans don't live on our own. God is the life that beats inside of our chests. God is the soul that fills our hearts. That's what makes humans living beings that need meaning. We search for meaning. Why is man searching for meaning? Because we come from a place of purpose. We're not going to fulfill that purpose by purchasing a lot of wonderful things, eating a lot of delicious foods, and having fun and going on vacations. We need a purpose that's higher, something bigger than our own lives. So now we have this craziness, this corona thing, yeah? And even right now in Eretz Yisrael, in the Holy Land, in Israel, the synagogues are closed again. What happened? The Jewish heart continues searching for meaning. We continue searching for our purpose. We don't give up. We don't say, that's it. The store is closed. God doesn't need anything else from us. As soon as the synagogues closed, the question of how do we get a minyan together immediately came up. We didn't want to stop. We'd never want to stop. We don't want to stop even now. Our soul is constantly yearning for expression. The soul is a piece of God. It's human nature. We have to be involved in something great. We have to be involved in something holy. It's a great story about Reb Elchanan Wasserman. He's one of the great Rosh Yeshivas of Lithuania. He wrote a famous book called Kevitz Shiurim. He was the Rosh Yeshiva of the Yeshiva Ohel Torah in Baranovich in Lithuania, and the yeshiva was struggling. And he was responsible for the upkeep of the yeshiva. He had no choice. He had to raise funds. He went on a big international trip. And his journey brought him to the United States. They told him in the United States, you could solve all your financial problems with one visit to the United States, they told him. Well, he comes to the new world, and they were very excited to greet him and see him and meet him and talk with him. But the funds that he was collecting was very poor. The people of the United States did not value yeshiva, where you groom young men to be Torah scholars instead of businessmen. They didn't see the value, they didn't see the purpose. And so They were giving very small gifts, and he was about to give up hope and go back home to Europe, where they valued this kind of venture of raising Torah scholars. And somebody told him, you know what? Before you go, there's one more person you have to meet him. He's in the Bronx. His name is Philip Goldstein. Philip Goldstein, he's very successful. He has the garment business. He makes shirts and coats, and he's very wealthy. And if you can open his heart, you'll never have to worry about your yeshiva again. He can take care of everything. And Rabbi Wasserman, he hears the name. He says, Philip Goldstein. Wow. We grew up together. He was my classmate. We were friends as kids. Well, he picks up the telephone. He calls Goldstein, and the secretary says, "Who's calling?" He says, "This is Rabbi Wasserman. Can I speak to Mr. Goldstein?" She says, "Sorry, he's busy. He's unavailable." And Rabbi Chanan Wasserman says, "Tell him that Elchanan from the shtetl," and he told him the name of the shtetl, is calling. And he hears in the background in the office that Five-ish Goldstein is yelling, Elchanan's on the phone. He have to let him in right away. So he goes in, and this guy, Philip, his friend Five-ish, is so excited to see him. He wants to give him a big tour of the whole factory, and he shows him every corner and the whole process, how you make the fabric and how you put together the shirts. And he was so proud. He was so proud of the success that he had put together in the new world. And then when he finishes the tour, he says to Rabbi Wasserman, he says, "So what brings you to these fine shores?" And Rabbi Chanan says, I came here to learn how to replace a button. I have to sew up my button. I'm missing a button on my coat. Oh, no problem. He brings him to the row in his factory, his garment factory. Brought him to the right place, and they sewed on this button, and he was so happy, and he sent him on his way with a big, warm goodbye. And Rabbi Chanan goes back to the hotel where he was staying, and soon after that, he gets a phone call. Five-ish Goldstein's on the phone. And his friend Five-ish says to him, Rabbi Chanan, now that I had a minute to calm down and catch my breath and get over the excitement of seeing you after so many years, I realize you're hiding something from me. You don't travel all the way from Baranovich to New York City to fix a button. What are you really here for? What are you really doing here? And Rabbi Chanan told him, you're right. You're absolutely right. I didn't travel here just for a button. It doesn't make sense that the soul should travel so far just to sew buttons. You too, Reb Five-ish, your soul took a very, very long journey, all the way from heaven, all the way to earth. And what are you spending your life on? Just sewing buttons. This coronavirus has reminded us, and every world's upheaval reminds us, we cannot be content with our own achievements. Rabbi Schneur Ashkenazi from Israel, he tells the following episode. He says it was Yom Kippur, and the guard at the door counted 20 men and then locked the door. Because after 20 men, God forbid, another man should come in and for Kol Nidre, they have to be very, very strict. And as they locked the door, he said he heard one of his congregants mumble to another one. He says, if God wanted to shake our sense of security, he did a very good job. And Rabbi Ashkenazi, he says, at that point, he was reminded of something that he had heard just a few months earlier. He was at a course. He's very prolific, Rabbi Ashkenazi. He's very prolific. He's all over the internet in Hebrew. He's a favorite lecturer in Hebrew. And he took a course on how to be more effective in communications via the fancy technologies of today. And the person giving the course, he told the students there, he says, people, we are in the year 2020. 2020 is the symbol of technological advancement. 2020 is the time when man knows everything, and if he doesn't know it now, with a click of a button, he'll know. There's nothing man cannot know. There's nothing man cannot do. And with a click of a button, you could be on the other side of the globe. At that point already, the coronavirus was cropping up in China. the giver of the course, the leader of this course, had no idea that 2020 was going to turn into the biggest disaster, the greatest symbol of the absolute helplessness of humanity. We could not imagine this. The absolute upheaval of this year is a tremendous reminder to us from Hashem, from God, that at no point will we survive just by glorifying our achievements. A world without God simply does not work. You will be left, God forbid, without direction, and you'll be left, God forbid, without hope. What is the coronavirus? It's a tiny little thing. You can't even see it. You can't even see it under a microscope. You need a super duper extra charged microscope to see this thing. It's very similar to what the Gemara says, that when Titus finished destroying Jerusalem and the Holy Temple, he mocked God, saying, "Where are you? You left your people to be destroyed. What happened to you?" And God responded by sending a gnat, G-N-A-T, a little fly, up Titus's nose, and it lodged in his brain, and it lived by feeding off of Titus's brain. And that was his punishment. He died in severe agony from that tiny little creature. As a reminder, there is a boss. There is a master of the universe. And a universe without a master, it's not going to work. Let's not forget why we're here. Let's not forget to listen to the voice of God in this craziness. Set aside the craziness for a minute and hear the message. God is reminding us there is a supreme power. We're here for a purpose. And hopefully, our focus, our renewed focus on our purpose, will lead us to the ultimate great illumination of the world and the revelation of that purpose with the coming of Mashiach speedily in our days. Good Shabbos, and thank you for joining.